Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for tonight's event here at Powell City of Books. Before we get started, I want to remind you that you can follow us on all forms of social media, including Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. Some exciting events that we have coming up include Sara A and Susan Straight. You can check out the rest of our enticing line of events by going to our website, powell.com. I do want to make a note that starting in April, I believe around April 1st, we'll also begin hosting an assortment of in-person events as well. So when you're looking at the events page, please note whether it says virtual or lists a store location because we don't want you to be disappointed. Tonight, we are excited to welcome local debut author Sara A. Mueller to our virtual stage. Sara is here to discuss her novel, The Bone Orchard. The Bone Orchard is a fascinating whodunit set in a lush gothic world of secrets and magic, where an imprisoned witch named Charm must figure out which of the emperor's sons is responsible for his murder in order to gain her freedom. And it came out today. So congratulations on your big launch here at Powell's. Woo!
Thank you very much.
All right, and Sara will be joined in conversation by Arkady Martine. Arkady Martine is a speculative fiction writer, and as Dr. Anna Linden Weller, a historian of the Byzantine Empire and a city planner. Under both names, she writes about border politics, rhetoric, propaganda, and the edges of the world. I'm holding her debut novel, Memory of Empire, which won a Hugo 2020 award. But you can also check out the sequel, which is also out now. Tonight's event will include a Q&A portion. So please ask any questions in the Q&A box below instead of in the chat, so that Arkady will be able to find them a lot faster. If you see any questions that you would also like to know the answer to, please click the like button so she'll know that this is a question that isn't to be missed. Throughout the event, I'll be dropping the links to both Sara and Arkady's Arkady's books in the chat. So that way you can just click on the links and support both authors and Powell's books. And if any other books that are mentioned in the chat that you want to know about, just make sure to ask us as well. Now, please give a warm welcome to Sara A. Mueller.
Thank you. So I thought I would start out this evening by reading to you guys a little bit. This one is on page 30, starts on page 37, so it's a little ways in. She has already been given her assignment, but since it's literally on the book cover, I didn't think it was going to be a spoiler. Were men ever faithful? Charm had no personal proof of it. She rose, checked her reflection briefly in the little mirror by the green baize door, and went on into the public part of the house. She went to survey the gentlemen taking their leisure in the card room. There was Count Sebro in his favorite chair, where he could see who was coming and going while he won at cards. He never won much, but nearly always left with just a little more than he laid out. He'd put Strephon on her emperor's throne. For all she knew, he'd been Strephon's hands for the poisoning. He was at the palace nearly every day and in the emperor's presence frequently. Lord Fergus was so afflicted with morality that he'd never booked a single appointment upstairs, not even for a bath or a massage. Lyle was ambitious enough, but she'd need to find out if he'd been at the palace the day of the poisoning. Lord Hanover, in addition to having married his wife, was wedded to the status quo. He had no reason Charm knew of to throw Boren to Strephon. Anders, bless him. He was possessed of a ridiculous good humor and a truly amazing tailor. The only bluff he'd ever been able to keep was for the length of a hand of cards. She knew their habits and characters better than their wives and sweethearts did. Was there even one among them she could trust? Among all the familiar faces was a novelty. He stood at one end of the bar, chatting with the faddish Mr. Anders, with his exquisitely polished boot up on the footrest. He wore the brown uniform of the Imperial Army with the cavalry major's insignia, the whole set off to advantage by being displayed on a tall, gracile man. Out of it, he might have been bony. In it, he was superb. His fair golden hair was longer than the current fashion, brushing past his collar and raked aside in the front like the forelock of a Palomino horse. How old was he? 17? 16 was the minimum for commissioned officer. It was difficult to tell his age from across a smoke-shrouded room. How damnable for him that someone had bought him a commission. What utterly evil swine would send their young man into Prince Aerleus' army? Someone who wanted to be rid of him. Charm moved through the card room. She paused to admire a hand here, to greet there, to touch a shoulder, give a smile, and drift on. One must not startle a man by walking straight up to him. They weren't used to it. Directness should be held in reserve as a weapon of discomfiture. She slid behind the bar, stepped up onto the little walk that put her and her bone ghosts on a comfortable height with their customers. Mr. Anders, may I get you and your young friend anything? She asked, smiling. 2 more brandies, if it ain't a bother, said Anders jovially. He was possibly the most jovial man in Borenguard. Major Nether, 'tis my vast good fortune to introduce you to Mistress Charm, our gracious hostess. Charm blinked. Nether? Forgive me, Major, I wasn't aware that there were any of the royal family left, aside from the Emperor's direct sons. There were far too many shocks and unknowns running amok these days. The young Major took his boot off the footrail and inclined his head and shoulders to Charm with immense propriety. There was a duel that angered a past empress. My branch hasn't been spoken of in quite some time. His voice was a pleasant, light tenor, his accent and enunciation perfectly blue-blooded. He was too young or too fair to need to shave much, if at all. He still looked in his teens, but his carriage and air of gravitas were not that of any teenager Charm had ever seen in Orchard House. Anders clasped Major Nether on the shoulder. Tell you what, I'll find us a card game. I'd like to take on Seabro with you. Dem me if I wouldn't. He meandered off, hailing friends heartily along the way, brandy snifter dangling negligently. Is he always that friendly, or is someone setting me up to lose my money? Nether asked, smiling a little. A glint of charisma that made it easy to smile back at him. This one was going to be dangerous when he grew up. He'll probably lose some money, but he isn't that sort. Mr. Anders may lack reticence, but it's nice now and then as a refresher to fashionable detachment. He seems a good chap, agreed Nether. My family history makes me jump at shadows, perhaps. If you can be safe anywhere in Boren, Major, I hope it is at Orchard House. She thought about the young Major's face more as she poured their brandies. There was something about his features that picked at the edges of her memory like a child picking at a scab. You seem familiar somehow, Major, and yet I feel sure I would remember you if I had met you before. The mind lock whirred in her temple, but didn't catch or bite. He smiled a bit, as if he heard it all the time, though with a face like that, he most certainly did not. It's probably family resemblance, Mistress. I haven't the old Emperor's strong build, sadly, but I share a shadow of the family's features with Prince Luther, and the hair is a pretty faithful marker of Nether's. Perhaps. People did say the Emperor had been beautifully blonde in his youth. By the time Charm had awakened, he'd been gray. None of the Emperor's sons inherited his hair. Are they not Nether's? Teased Charm, testing him. Major Nether smiled, nearly grinned. They are imperial princes, Mistress. Their father, may he rest at last, married from abroad. The last word, though the tone was mellow, held a snobbish, well-bred clip that made Charm suppress a smile. That scorn of the foreign had kept the Emperor's string of wives from ever fitting into Boren well enough to be in danger of popularity. Nether was, though so distant he'd been mislaid for a while, in line behind the princes for the imperial throne. He was unable to refuse to go into Prince Aerlius' madness when ordered to do so. I am so sorry that my bone ghosts are all busy this evening. It would have been an honor to accommodate you. Are you due to ship out soon? I only just arrived back in town. A health situation required that I retire for a time to the country. The Emperor gave me the honor of assigning me as an imperial courier before his death. Hardness settled into his eyes, his smile a facial gesture of perfect politeness over a terrible wound. The look passed away as ease rolled in to conceal it, like fog blanketing Lowtown and shielding well-bred eyes from the sight. Nether's smile was quite handsome. But then it was my fortune to fall in with Anders, so my evening is made pleasant. A health situation, so young. That was when it struck her. Nether was wearing powder. Men hadn't worn powder for decades upon decades, but Charm could just remember when very fashionable men had done so. Nether's makeup, however, was not to produce elegant fair skin, quite the opposite. Colored base with powder and rouge, just the slightest brush of it, put a healthy complexion on top of a pallor that bordered on deathly. Even his lips were pale beneath the cosmetic that stained them a normal color. The Emperor had done some dreadful damage to this beautiful young man, ruined him before he was even in his prime. It hurt, a truth flung into her eyes like lemon juice until she wanted to blink and closed against the burn and sting. I'm going to go ahead and stop there. I can go on later maybe, but it just occurred to me that piece is going longer than I thought it would.
It's so good though.
Thank you.
I mean, when we were talking earlier about what you wanted to read, and I was like, I want you to read something that like shows the character work. What I love about that scene is really, it's a really early scene, is how much you are showing us because of who is watching, who is doing the observing, what she notices. It's one of the things that I enjoyed about the entire book, is that kind of hyper localized internality that your characters have. And I guess that can open up into my first question for you, which is, how did you come up with Charm? Where did she come from?
She came from a role-playing game that was a spy-based game, and I had to come up with a character on the fly, and the idea of sex workers as spies is hardly a new one. It's as old as the hills, in fact. So I decided that I would play the madam of a brothel. And then I was taken with the idea of how dangerous that could actually be, especially as sex workers aren't someone that anyone thinks of as being dangerous. They're so often victims. They're really never considered that way unless you're in intelligence services or in secret keeping yourself. So basically she came from an off-the-cuff idea for a role-playing character. Although at that point she wasn't as divided as she is just one.
Only one of her at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is a really old trope to have a sex worker, a madam, as the repository of intrigue and plots. But it's an old trope because it's a good one. And one of the things that I think that it allows you to explore in this book is the way that sex work can be both traumatic and very much not so for different people at different times. Both people who seek out sex workers and for the sex workers themselves. And I was wondering if you'd want to talk a little bit about the differences between how different versions of Charm and different clients at Orchard House view sex work.
Well, I think that for certainly a certain segment of the male population, they view it as with a sort of matter of course attitude. They are wealthy, powerful men. These are women. They are women who are there literally for their pleasure. And they don't, for a certain segment of them, they wouldn't even bother to consider the feelings of the individual characters who they're involved with. They are there for the service, as it were. I think that with a lot of the characters here, you sort of can gauge whether they are what they're like as human beings by how they treat people who are below them. And so the characters that treat the bone ghosts well are either genuinely nice people or want something from them that is more than just the job, as it were. And of course, that's part of the question, is who's spying on who in that? Obviously, because Payne only sees one set of clients, she sees a lot of them, but she sees only fire drinkers. So because they share a certain condition of being mind locked, like Charm does, that is her specialty. She has a specialty clientele, let's say. Whereas the other bone ghosts have a more generalized clientele, depending on what a gentleman is looking for that evening, and how they view their clients varies greatly, sort of depending on their natures themselves. obviously they're named for qualities. So pride looks at them entirely differently than shame or desire might.
The fragmentation or doubling, because I think it's both, and that was one of the things that I very much enjoyed reading this book, was that the bone ghosts and the original are both fragments and twins and doubles. There's a certain element of doppelganger horror in here, which I very much liked the complication of. So in making that choice, in having most of your characters in the demi-monde be essentially reflections of a single person. And I'm actually going to pull from one of the questions that was asked earlier. Bethany asked if Charm and the Rest were meant to be commentary on mental health and trauma, and I want to sort of expand that in a way of the choice of creating these characters as a set of reflections, as aspects of a original self or a central self. Original is complicated. Was that one that you came into writing this book with, or is it one that developed? Were there originally more people in Orchard House than just the Bone Ghosts and Charm and the lady?
There were originally more of them, in that I sort of made a list of qualities, if you will, but as they were there from the start of this book. That was part of the inception idea. And then as I sorted out what her past actually was, and gradually got my head around how many of them I could workably handle and represent, it narrowed down and sharpened out to the set that stay here. It's interesting. They definitely are individual at the same time. Yeah, they're all the same. And they are certainly a fantasized version of dissociated identity disorder after a fashion, in that they are holders of trauma. They hold pieces of Charm's past and the lady's past that are, sources of significant trauma for one reason or another. So there are ways that the original mind has defended itself by making someone who could do it.
Who could deal with it.
Who could deal with it, even if it was just take it.
Yeah.
Even if it's just stand there and take the abuse, that's still useful to a brain that's trying not to die.
There's a deep thread in this book about trying to hang on to one's sense of self. And that's not solely a thematic note for Charm and for the Bone Ghosts. It's wider than that. And I was wondering how you thought about that sense of a possessed self, a solid self, and its relationship to spies and spy work.
Ooh. Well, spy work is often a matter of memory, right? I mean, your book is all about that in a lot of ways. In fact, in every way. But yeah, as a spy, who you present, I think, isn't always who you are. And just as we all present ourselves slightly differently, I would present myself differently to a class of high school students than I would to a class of kindergartners, than I might be with my parents or my friends or my siblings. We all have slightly different shades of ourself, perhaps, that we present at different times, and this is a very extreme form of that. But when you're a spy, I think it takes being very, very careful what you pick and choose to reveal, because it has to be true enough that people believe you. But if you give them too much, then you're no longer the one in charge of the situation. And that's always a problem. And of course, it's one that Charm has as well, because even if she can't remember her past, it doesn't mean it isn't there. So I don't know that I answered that question very well.
Oh, no, I think you did. I've always thought about spies and spy work and identity work in general as being about believing two things at once entirely, two mutually contradictory things, two mutually contradictory selves, which are equally true, depending on who's looking or what angle you're at. And it is fascinating to put it into the context of a central spy character who is both only accidentally in some ways a spy. I mean, Charm did not set out to do spy work. And also someone who is deliberately and for reasons of self-protection already fragmented. It creates a certain tension in wondering if she's going to be able to do it again or maintain it for what she needs to do.
That's always a trick, especially because she's done it before. And the which ghosts are in and which ghosts are out is a matter of physically being able to have a body for them, for her. And so if one of them is killed or damaged to the point that they have to be demobilized to repair them, then she has a problem, because then she has the memory back. Well, she doesn't have the memory back, but she has this other person in her head again. And it's one thing to be able to walk out of a room when pride is telling you what you ought to be doing, as opposed to what you are doing. It's quite another when you have pride sitting in the back of your cerebellum saying, excuse me, you might want to do something else.
Slightly better. Yeah,
exactly.
There's several points within the book where some of the bone ghosts do not have their own bodies to walk around in. And the degree of their integration varies. Sometimes, and I found this interesting as someone who loves unreliable narrators, sometimes more than Charm herself is aware of that degree of how integrated they are versus how absent they are. Are they sort of locked in the back room of that particular cerebellum, or have they already perfused everything?
That's a question that she doesn't always know. As you say, it's very difficult to look into your own brain and know what it's doing or why it's doing what it's doing. Sometimes it takes a little more perspective than one has on oneself. Even though you might lose your temper at a certain stimulus, you don't always correctly identify what that stimulus is. So yeah, that is one of the questions that Charm has on and off through the book, is how much are the other personalities that are in her body affecting her, and how much of it is just her affecting her. And of course, the things she thinks she doesn't like about herself, she's going to attribute to someone else.
Somebody else. How convenient,
it
really.
Seems easier.
Yeah.
It's the ultimate get out of jail free card. It wasn't
me. It's not me, it's the other version of me.
Someone else entirely.
Yep. So in addition to being multiple people at various times, Charm is a kind of psychic, not psychic in the like tarot cards over the phone for pocket change way, but in the sense of being able to have a certain degree of telepathy or memory. It's complex, and also is kind of a necromancer. more than kind of.
More than
but
kind of. Yeah, well,
complicated necromancy. It's not like, oh, look, a dead guy, let's make him not dead.
Yeah.
Would be a lot more convenient for Charm at various points if that was the version of necromancy she did.
oh, so much easier.
So in what ways did choosing a sort of suite of psychic or telekinetic or mind powers change how you approached this novel versus what might be a more traditional fantasy magic system? As there isn't really a magic system per se in this book.
No, there really isn't. It meant that the effect, right, the magic, right, the effect was always going to be localized to a person unless that was explicitly part of their power. So the fire drinker captain, Captain Oram, he is an immensely powerful telepath and can communicate with the rest of the fire drinkers across a distance, but he can't read your mind from that distance. He has to be in your presence in some way, although the range of that obviously varies. In his case, he is quite powerful. In the case of some of the other characters, their powers just aren't that strong. Charm is a psychometer, so she touch reads objects or people, which is a kind of empathy, which is also how I viewed her ability to encourage the growth of the bone trees in the orchard. Sort of a way of touching on them that made them remember what they were to begin with, as it were.
She is in many ways a memory worker. When
yes.
she touches things, she sees sometimes the most important parts of their histories.
She has she's been trained for that at one point, which we find out partway through, but yeah, she was at one point trained for that. And a lot of that, at least in the beginning of the book, is very locked away because that's not part of what she does. She is charm. She is there to be charming. That's not charming. It might be useful. It would be very, very
a little
useful.
creepy.
And it's a little creepy. So having her struggle with that and try to access that at some points, that's specifically the lady's power, so that Charm has to sort of attempt to pickpocket or beg, borrow, or steal this ability, because her name is her gift. She is charming. She knows how to present herself attractively. But she is not necessarily, at least at the beginning, able to access those powers, which is very frustrating for her because otherwise she could solve the mystery
very quickly,
easily, pretty quick.
Yeah.
The first thing you have to do with anybody who can see the past in mystery is take the power away.
That problem is so true. Like the degree of nonsense I put myself through in a similar situation of I have got to make it. If I let Mahit talk to Iskander for more than about 15 pages, I won't have a story.
Yeah, I admired that actually. I thought you were very elegant about how you did that. And it's the same problem, right?
It's exactly the same problem. It's the, well, almost all novels, I think, about spies and political intrigue are actually information control novels.
Yes.
And not just internally, not just in the world of the book, though they're very much that, who knows what, but also the relationship between the story and the reader is an information control problem that the author has to negotiate. So when does the reader get to know things as opposed to when does the character get to know things, and to keep that level of tension. And you do a bunch of partial reveals, so it kind of becomes an unfolding recontextualization. And I, speaking entirely as a fellow practitioner of this weird art, want to know how the hell you revised this book.
I revised it. This book I sort of Coyle wrote. I didn't write it straight through and then go back and do the revisions. I had a bunch of very patient people who read it as I wrote it, basically, so that they would say, this is broken. And I would go, is it broken? Did I mean that? Yeah, no, maybe. But I could think, oh, there's something here that I had intended them to know by now. And so I could go back and salt that back in.
Yep.
From the beginning. The only thing I didn't ever really touch after I had revised it once was the very beginning chapters, because I needed a touchstone so that in all of this going back and going back and going back and sort of continuously padding it, I could eventually go back and look at the beginning of the book and go, oh, right. That's what I'm doing.
I know is going on.
This is the book I promised. This is the book I have to try to write. Darn it, why did I promise that? I lost my mind, my God. But that was the part that stayed very stable. And then it was just a matter of sort of a little more salt, a little more oregano.
Mm-hmm.
Oops, too much salt, maybe a little more water now.
Yeah. I think probably we had similar processes. I wrote straight through and then went back and added an entire other subplot and split a character into two people.
I admire that.
So he stopped contradicting himself motivation-wise.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. Well, that was the bit I couldn't solve with the very smart edits, was this, you have this happening, and then you say that he's doing it for this reason. Except no.
Except that doesn't work.
Had to be two people. But yeah, at this point, I no longer know where the seams are in memory. It's been like 3 years since it came out, and like 5 since I finished it.
Yeah.
And that it's a strange thing that happens with that kind of rewriting, I think. I don't know if you find that true too, where you can't see what you changed anymore. You don't have that version in your head.
The only thing I still know that I changed with this is when I began to write it, someone else had done the murder. And partway through, I realized I was wrong. I had been entirely wrong. I had laid in all the appropriate clues already. I didn't even have to change those. All I had to sort of change was where I was going and how it was going to end out, because I had to figure out then how to get at the new person who was, actually responsible. And once I had realized who had actually done it, then it was a real head scratcher for a while.
I knew who had done the murder in mine, but I didn't know who had done the sabotage, and I got it wrong as I was writing.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's always good to know you're not the only one that had that
Nope,
problem.
not at all. Yeah, I want to pull us back for a sec before we get too in the weeds on craft, even though I love talking about it, and talk about a different kind of craft, which is what the lady does out in the greenhouses. And this amazing thread of deep, weird Gothic horror that you've got, that feels really organic to me in the setting and in the world. But when I look at the genre categories of this book, it makes it complicated. The lady's a bit of a mad scientist, and it feels like it comes from that tradition, what she does in the gardens. So how did you come up with that, and where did it come from? Where does the bone tree concept derive?
The bone tree concept, a friend that I was in another role-playing game with, a completely different one, had done a sketch of a tree where the fruit was all bones. And I said, oh, that's so cool. Do you mind if I use that someday. I had no idea where it was going to go, what it was going to be, but it was just such a cool idea. And he said, sure. So off I went, merrily on my way. And after a while, I thought, oh, I know where that goes. Especially because the concept that, you know, they keep coming back. The bones keep regrowing. It was very attractive. And I thought very Gothic, because Gothic literature is so much about the past coming back to haunt you and to ruin your life. But I think also the restriction of Victorian and Gothic society, at least in England, was such that it gave me the very hyper structured, very delineated role kind of a society that I needed, where it's perfectly okay for a gentleman to go off to play cards and dine out.
Mhm.
But that's what they're doing, unless someone can prove otherwise. And if someone can prove otherwise, then that's not all right. And that structure of society seemed like it was very ideal for this kind of idea of how much are you restricted and in what way. Because there are certainly people here in this world of the Bone Orchard that are very restricted in what they can and can't do, even though they don't have mind locks at all. But on the other hand,
kinds of mind locks. There's mind locks and mind locks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that was one of the things I was interested in playing with. And, you know, how much can you skate around a command and still, you know, it's good enough.
Yeah. There's
Have
some
a bit
very
of a
interesting
headache.
questions of free will in here, both with the command of the mind locks, which, let's see if I can describe this in about 3 seconds for those of you who haven't read the book yet. Let's see if I can do it. Tell me if I get it wrong. So there are these neat little clockwork crystals with, and they're implanted into the brains of people who have various psychic powers. And they both allow some control over those powers, so the powers don't burn out the person who has them. And they seem to make the person who is carrying one of those mind locks subject to the commands of the person who installed them, if that person is good enough at it. So Charm has one. Several of the other important characters have one. All of the sort of Emperor's Secret Police, the fire drinkers, who are also all psychics of various kinds, have them. How fun is it to have to invent the name of the Emperor's Secret Police, by the way?
Oh, that was a ton of fun, actually. I don't know why they're called. I didn't know at first why they were even called the fire drinkers. They just were, because it was the coolest name I could think of at the moment. But they are called that for, obviously, the reason that they can actually suppress emotion. So they can sort of drink the fire out of a crowd, as it were, because of some of them. But one of the questions of the book, I think, was what do you do with people who are going to either in their, you know, mid-20s, probably, maybe they'll get older. That's generally not a good thing. But in their mid-20s, they're either going to lose their mind by that point, or they're going to explode. If you were a pyromancer, you might take a whole city block with you if you were powerful enough. What do you do with someone like that? How do you, you know, balance the fact that they're still a person and their parents still love them and they still have a life, but you can't have them in downtown at a certain point because they're going to
don't know when that point is going to be.
And you don't know when that point's going to be. And for people who are telepaths, at what point do they lose track of the plot in their own head and who they are? Or if they're an empath, when does that just make them break? in a way that can be very private or in a way that could be entirely horrific. So Boren deals with it one way with the crystal mind locks, and Inshil dealt with it another way by having them locked away
Kind of
at the,
your religious prison.
And basically a religious institution where they have a job, they work for the state basically, but they are still restrained in their movements, even though it's for their own good. It's not something that, it's not, they have their complete liberty, which was one of the questions that the book doesn't have good answers to, because honestly, I haven't got good answers for that either.
Built a world that doesn't have good answers to that question. So you just have a lot of good questions.
I didn't think that there should be a neat answer to that. It doesn't strike me that the world has neat answers for lots of problems.
Yeah, that's really true.
So, yeah.
So we're at about the 43, 45 mark, depending on your time zone, what hour goes in front of that. So I want to grab some of the questions from the audience, and please feel free to add more. I've been weaving them in as I can, but some of them are more direct questions. I'll throw some of those at you, Sara.
Okay.
Fran wants to know who your favorite resident of Orchard House is.
Oh, tough one. Obviously, I love Charm, or I could have quit writing about her before I finished this book, and that would have been really comforting. I love them all in one way or another. I mean, I just do. I enjoy Pain for her empathy, for her ability to make other people feel better. I love Pride. I love Pride. She's thorny and she's ramrod straight, and she is so entirely herself, apparently, that I do love her. My heart broke for Desire every time I wrote her. Yeah, if I hadn't liked them so much, I probably could have just quit writing this book at the points where I was waking up at 3 a.m. going, gotta go write. Can't leave them there. Gotta get them out. It's not fair.
I am going to point out that someone, Christina, has asked who originally was the murderer, but allow you to not spoil the book if you don't want
Yeah,
to.
sorry. Sorry, I'll give it more than opening day. I'll come back.
This is your launch day. I mean, congratulations. Seriously, it's a big thing. It's often. Oh God, that's one. I guess that's for me and for you. Fran also would like to know what Tixcalanli name would Charm get, which is great. That's a great question. I kind of love it.
Oh gosh. Probably.
Do you have a noun? Because I have a number.
I was going to say maybe 7 perfume.
That's nice. A 7 would work. I was thinking a 9.
9 would be good.
I
would think
she might be too not settled to be a 9.
Yeah.
Yeah. 9 is 3 3s.
Yeah, 9 gives it a certain symmetry that she
Mhm.
doesn't quite have. That's kind of why I picked 7, is because I figured it's just off kilter. There's no way to make that a stable shape.
Yep.
It's hard to draw a star like that.
I like that. A lot.
Because she is fairly unstable, let's face it.
They'd all probably be different, all of the bone ghosts. They might share a number, but they wouldn't have the same nouns.
No, they would be very
Or they would share a noun and not have the same numbers. I think that's what I would choose if I was writing them.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, so you could number them so that they could be, perfume 1, first 1 perfume, 2 perfume, 3 perfume,
etc.
Right.
Yeah. But then that's because the Tixcalanli naming system does a lot with the numbers, what you've done with the sort of names of qualities.
Yeah, it does actually. It's very much when I read your book, I thought, oh, I could have done that. Such a good idea. So much easier than when you're trying to write a sentence that says someone is in pain and you don't mean that the way it's supposed to sound.
That would be a different sentence that means something else.
Yeah, it did make certain aspects of sentence writing a little challenging.
On the other hand, all of the words you've used are ones that people will recognize and not ask you how you are keeping track of all of the names.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, mine were easier on that regard, for sure. Especially because in your naming system, it is very complex and based so much in the literature and the history of the place. And these are simpler in that they embody the kind of trauma as well as sort of their general purpose for being, which is a little different than what a name traditionally does.
Yeah, it's an internal creation versus a societal creation.
Right. Yeah.
Like Charm and the Lady have made these things, these people that are aspects. And when I'm picking Teixcalali names for characters, I'm thinking about a society that would imagine a person like this as being a certain way.
Right. You're trying to give them an appropriate a name so that someone who meets them for the first time goes, oh.
Yeah.
Adds. Oh.
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 Yes.
I see.
I really do need to put, when I get around to writing more Teixcalali, I need to have someone with a name that completely doesn't match their personality. They're just absolutely stuck with. I actually want to grab Christine's question on, and this one's for you, which is, how did you decide on the Victorian setting? We've talked about that a little bit, but also, were you inspired at all by Frankenstein?
Oh, of course. Yeah. Frankenstein was part of my initial elevator pitch. Because obviously it's about the creation of a human being out of parts of other human beings. And that was just, it was inescapably going to have qualities of that in it. And what makes you, I mean, Frankenstein deals a lot with what makes you a real person, what makes you more than just, in Victorian thinking, a beast, right? But what does that mean internally? And when are the people who are looking at you as a beast, when are they wrong? That maybe you're already a person and they just haven't caught up to that fact yet, which is something that so many people have that as a real life problem. So yeah, Frankenstein definitely was huge.
Were there other literary influences that you feel are as strong as Frankenstein?
Oh yeah, actually, I would have to say that Edith Wharton is a novelist that, unless you really like Victorian literature, she is not going to be your thing. Okay, straight up fair warnings. But she wrote about the place of women in Victorian society as she observed it herself. They are not bright, happy, fun reads, but they are very beautiful. And one of her novels was actually one of the very few books that ever just made me like ugly cry. I got to the end of it. I was reading it for a class. I got to the last chapter of Custom of the Country. And just about the last 4 paragraphs made me just suddenly just ugly sob, like I had been punched up under my diaphragm, because it turned the tables so neatly. And I would also probably say that, honestly, one of my favorite books of all time is The Count of Monte Cristo, because it's so complicated. The unexpurgated version is like a phone book. I mean, well, for those of you who remember phone books, it's like this thick.
I remember phone books. We had those when I was a kid.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But yeah, so I would have to say, give a lot of credit to those two. And of course, I grew up reading science fiction and fantasy of my, as it was written, basically through my youth. And there's probably a lot in there too, but
I have got to, and this is like a personal query from me. Have you read God Gabriel Kay's Tigana?
oh yeah.
Because
Yes,
oh
I would,
my
yes,
God,
that
this
one's
hit me that way really
Yep.
hard. It's like one of my favorite books.
yes,
So
the forgetting.
there's a bunch of Brandon and Dianora in here.
There is. I hadn't thought of it, but that's very on the, that's yep. I would have to say, yep, can't deny that one would have been I did read it. In fact, I read it into pieces several times.
Mm-hmm.
Paperbacks, they just don't last.
They don't
as well.
last. They really don't.
Well, not when you're hiking them through a lot of moving boxes anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I would have to say that one for sure. I mean, I think that the books we read, whether we like it or not, sort of invade our creativity and inform it, even if they don't directly influence it.
I think they absolutely do. I mean, that's how we are in conversation with each other.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's, that movies, our lives, all those things, you can't help it.
Yeah, what you read, what you see, what you hear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right, we have time for at least one pretty meaty question. Okay. So Bethany would like to know how both of us, but you first, Sarah, this is your book, your day, grapple with the question of personhood and what that means, and how do we approach writing that?
Wow, that is a meaty question. You're not wrong. That's a really good question, and it certainly is pretty central to the Bone Orchard. The personhood is one of the questions here for this book, in that even the bone ghosts sometimes aren't sure whether they're themselves a person or not. It's something that Payne grapples with quite a bit, because she didn't come with any memories. She was just a blank spot. She was the first blank spot that was just there with, can't cope with the pain, I'm out, says the brain. So she does grapple with that. Is she a person or is she not a person? If you ask Pride would of course say, of course I'm a person. Don't be terrible. And shame would rather not be, in a lot of ways. So I think for me, it varied both internally and externally, because some of the citizens of the city see them as things, the bone ghosts in particular, as things, not as people, because they are created. But when it wears a human face, when it talks to you, when they speak to you, eventually the odds are you start to regard them as a personality, and eventually as a person. It's when you're familiar with something, you cease to have the same kind of fear of it. You might still respect that this is a very large carnivore and it can kill me, but the animal itself, and so you view it in a different way than you might when you're not familiar with tigers or sharks or wolves or whatever it is you're interacting with. A wildlife biologist who is better informed is going to see them differently than someone who isn't familiar at all. You grapple with that too, though, in your book. I know you do. Because dead people, are they still people?
Sort of, maybe. I think that's one of the ways that I was working with that question, is how much of a person is memory and how much of a person is a body, and what happens when you combine those in unexpected ways. And I was also working with, when is a person defined as a person by a society, and who gets to pick what kind of person someone is, and are all sorts of persons not equal but equally valid? The answer in the world of the Texan and the Empire being no, obviously. And quite honestly, the answer on LaSalle Station also being no, obviously.
But in a different
but
way.
in a completely different way.
Yeah.
But yeah, writing it is at times very personal and at times very difficult, and also really, really fascinating. I did a whole bunch of research on endocrinology and neurology, and then threw out all the neurology and kept all the endocrinology. Like
Yeah.
I kept all the stuff about how bodies make people into people, and specific people. All of that's pretty accurate. I don't think an actual endocrinologist would like throw me out of bed for eating crackers. But all of the neurology is absolutely bogus. And I really, quite honestly, should like stick that in an author's note somewhere.
Yeah, I had the same dilemma, obviously. And for me, one of the other things was knowing that in some respect, I was going to hurt somebody writing about this. I mean, this is going to be uncomfortable for someone. That question is too commonly asked in the real world, right? So that's part of it, is that it's just not comfortable to ask these questions, but they're the ones that are so interesting.
Yeah.
So interesting to sort of try to uncover them and go, oh, hey, look
at this.
This is terrible and gross.
Yes. Like opening a tank on something that's gone wrong.
Exactly.
Well done for that scene, by the way, which I will not spoil for anyone, mostly because I don't squick easy and you got me. Mold is bad. I don't like it. All right, we are nearly at the end, but I do want to just like pull up the last of the really meaty questions to sort of gloss at very gently, which is the one about gender, about playing with gender, and whether you can talk about that just for a minute or so.
Sure. I mean, all of the fire drinkers, obviously, they're all genders. They're all there. Being psychically gifted isn't confined by gender in any way. And so because they're the social norm is that they are anonymous, completely, utterly anonymous. You'll know one is tall, one is short, one is, you know, depending, right? You can't, it's difficult to hide major morphological differences, but they all operate as if they are equals, because they all are to themselves. Among themselves, they're all perfectly equal. They don't give some roles to boys and some roles to girls, because the coats only come in one color. And everybody's wearing the same chains, and everybody's in each other's heads all the time. And after a while, they just don't care. And so that was interesting to me, that even though many of them are women, you know, absolutely proportional example of the society are women, the majority of the citizens of Borenguard would automatically view them as male because they're in pants, which is a pretty non-specific, but that's what they are. Whether they are male or female under that, or something in anywhere in between on the spectrums, it doesn't matter, because they present in a masculine, traditionally masculine role. So the people there, regardless, don't care what's under there.
Or don't notice, which is really interesting.
Yeah, or just don't notice, because
it's the role, not the actual gender.
Yeah, their gender has their gender does not matter at all. At all. And you know, if you're a telekinetic and you can throw someone across a room, does it matter what your gender is?
Not very much.
No, not really. If that person can make you burst into flames, don't really care what's under the uniform. That was really fun to do, to simply have, and you know, it's easy to assume all guys.
Nope.
No, explicitly no. And of course that's part of, but because charm is aggressively feminine in how she portrays herself. That's also why in this society, nobody tends to think of her as dangerous. You know, nobody with that bust line is going to be dangerous, surely. What? I mean, like, to us, that seems a little blind,
but it's not so far off.
No.
And I mean, I really like how much space there is between presentation and identification in what you're doing with gender. It's really interesting. And I think very evocative of a very particular society and its particular biases.
Yeah, definitely heavily biased. And that was one of the real challenges writing it, actually, was that there were places where I had to go, okay, I just have to walk away and do this a lot because I just feel gross because I just wrote this and it's going to look one way and it shouldn't be. Yuck. So yeah, I had fun with that, and with the fire drinkers in particular, but with the assumption that the clothes make the person what they are in some way.
Yeah.
In some ways that I would have to believe that some of the women who become fire drinkers would find that very freeing, to not have to be in a dress and to be viewed as just as dangerous as everyone else.
All right. Thank you so much for this conversation. I've had a marvelous time, and it is a brilliant book, and I think you all should immediately buy it if you haven't already. And
you should buy her book too, because she does a lot of the same things in a completely
there's a lot
different
of
way.
really interesting commonalities, which I love. Super fun to find ways that different people approach the same problems, same interesting questions.
Yeah.
Well, all right. Thank you both for joining us. You can buy both of their books from us here at Powell's. There you go. They like match. Look at them. Oh, best friends. I want to thank you both for joining us. Thank you everyone who came to this event. Stay tuned for more interesting events, and we will see you again soon. Bye everyone.
Bye. Thank you.